In the communication discipline, we tend to mean something rather specific when we say communication. In this lecture, I will define what communication is, what communication competence is, and how communication competence relates to gender. Our definition of communication involves three defining characteristics. First, communication requires two or more parties. A party is a person or a group of people with a similar goal. If Taylor Swift and Kanye West are having a conversation, each of them is a party. When Taylor Swift and her team create a music video, that whole team is a party, and we, the audience, the millions of individuals who watch that video, are also a party. So a party is a person or group of people, and we need two parties for communication to take place. Note that in the communication discipline, we do not study how animals or computers communicate, so the people in these parties are actual people, human beings. Our second defining characteristic of communication is that communication is an interactive process. A process is dynamic, it's evolving and changing. In other words, communication is a verb. The parties have to be doing something for communication to take place. The thing they're doing is interacting. They're affecting one another in some way. So if two people hear or see each other, there's a process taking place between the two parties. We still need one more characteristic for this interaction to be communication. An interaction between two parties becomes communication when the parties ascribe meaning to what they see and hear. And that's our third defining characteristic. Meaning is a difficult word to define, but I think you know what it means. If something has meaning, you're connecting it to an idea in your mind. This mental connection is the process of interpretation. If you see a bird, like your eyes see the bird, but your brain doesn't connect that visual to anything in particular, then you're not interpreting anything. Your eyes are working, you did see it, but you're not interpreting any actual meaning from what you saw. If you see that bird and then think bird, like the word bird, now you're interpreting what you've seen and you're creating meaning. You're using symbols, like words, to make the image have meaning, to connect it to ideas in your mind. So meaning requires interpretation, and interpretation requires symbols, and all of this is happening in your head. So if you, a person, are interacting with another person and you're interpreting something they said or did, even how they smell, communication is now taking place. To summarize, communication requires two parties, interaction between the parties, and interpretation of meaning through the use of symbols. Note that communication does not require accurate interpretation. If I say, don't forget about the quiz, but you mishear me and believe that you don't have to take the quiz, then that's miscommunication. You did not interpret the same meaning that I intended. Miscommunication is still communication, it's just bad communication. Communication also does not require intent. If you did not intend to send a message, but you did anyway, and someone interpreted that message, or in other words, attributed meaning to it, we still have communication. All the requirements are there. We have two parties, we have a process, and we have interpretation. Bad communication and unintentional communication is still communication. If there's such a thing as bad communication, then there must also be good communication. Some scholars got really interested in what makes communication good or bad and developed theories of competent communication. There was quite some debate during the 1970s and 80s, and today I will share with you two of the resulting theories. First, the descriptive theory of communication competence claims that communication must be appropriate and effective to be competent. The goal of this theory is to describe competent communication, or perhaps to understand it. The nature of this kind of theory is really to develop a deep understanding of what communication is. In other words, this theory is rooted in the interpretive paradigm. Now that we have a sense of the underlying assumptions of this theory, let's explain its central claim. Competent communication is both appropriate and effective. Appropriate communication is communication that follows the norms of a given situation. Norms are sometimes spoken but often unspoken rules that exist for how we are supposed to behave in a given situation. Norms change from situation to situation. They definitely also change from culture to culture. Think about what it is that you're supposed to do when you hear someone sneeze. In the United States, the norm is that you say, "Bless you." Even if you don't know them, if you're standing in an elevator with someone and they sneeze, a lot of people will just say, "Bless you." In other cultures, though, that is not the norm. And in fact, saying something when someone sneezes is considered very rude. You're pointing out that somebody's doing some disgusting bodily function. It's gross. Why would you point it out? So, norms are those unspoken rules, those things that we learn without even realizing that we're supposed to do, supposed to say in a given situation. Appropriate communication is communication that follows all those rules, that knows all the rules of that given situation, that given context, that given culture, and follows all the rules. That's appropriate communication. Effective communication achieves an individual's goals. Now, to know if communication is effective, you have to first know what that individual's goals are. Often it's to be understood or to express one's ideas clearly. Perhaps it's to persuade somebody else or to share information. All of those might be goals. But sometimes a person's goal might be to deceive someone, to manipulate someone. And so depending on what a person's goals are, we can determine how effective they were in achieving those goals. So effectiveness really depends on the individual party's goals. If I want to determine if you are a competent communicator, I first have to have a good idea of what your goals are. The knowledge for how to communicate is based on the context. First, you must know the norms for communication in your given context. The context consists of broad influences like culture, but also specific influences like individual preferences of the people you're communicating with. What is expected of you here in this context? Your knowledge of those norms is what affects your competence. To become a competent communicator, make sure you know the norms for your given context. What are the norms in this country and culture? What are the norms in this organization? What are the norms in this department? What norms does this particular person have for communication? We often take these norms for granted, but a competent communicator will be aware and knowledgeable about them. Once you have the knowledge for how to communicate, now you have to actually be able to do that thing. That's where skill comes in. You've got to be able to communicate in those expected ways. If people are expecting you to stay quiet, reserved, and not voice your opinion, that's a skill you've got to be able to hone. For some people, that's really hard to do. So skills are things that we need to develop and practice in order to become good at them. The most competent communicators have many skills, and so we often talk about having a toolkit. Having many tools in your toolkit allows you to be a more competent communicator because when the norms change, you can then communicate according to those norms because you have all of those skills available to you. If the only skill you have is blurting out and being very honest right away with your opinions, then that's the only skill that you can perform. Even if you know that the norms say we should be quiet and reserved and keep our opinions to ourselves in this context, if you don't have that skill, you're not going to be able to use it. So, our toolkit is really the large group of skills that we have in terms of communication. And skill, in terms of being a competent communicator, is being able to actually enact, to actually do the thing that you're supposed to do. Competent communicators know what the norms are, and they're also able to follow those norms because they have the appropriate skills. But competent communicators also have a third characteristic, and that is that they're motivated and willing to actually do what they're supposed to do. If you know what you're supposed to do and you're able to do what you're supposed to do, you also have to want to do what you're supposed to do. If you don't care, you're uninterested, you're unmotivated, then you're still not going to be a competent communicator. You've got to value competence in order to be a competent communicator. If you don't care how other people react and you don't think that competence is a worthwhile pursuit, then you're never going to be a competent communicator. Now, research has shown over and over again that competent communicators are more effective. In fact, it's part of our descriptive definition of communication competence. You actually accomplish your goals. This is the closest that I can offer you to improving your own motivation to become a competent communicator. But it's something that really has to come from within you. That's about as much help as I can offer. So I urge you to please value being a competent communicator. It will get you further in life. Be motivated to be a competent communicator. And that's how you're going to get all the way to communication competence. So, why talk about communication competence in this context? Well, first, this is a communication course. So, of course, I want you to know what communication is and specifically what good communication is. But second, communication competence is linked to gender in many ways. Let's explore just two of those ways here. Our cultural norms are often based on gender. In order to be competent, you must be appropriate. But being appropriate is actually different for men and women, for boys and girls. Norms vary by culture, as with sneezing, but they also vary based on who you are. It's normal for a 2-year-old to eat spaghetti with their hands. It is not normal for an adult to do that. Similarly, it's normal for a woman to wear a dress, nail polish, and makeup. But when a man does the same, many consider it to be a violation of norms, specifically of nonverbal communication norms. This semester, we'll often talk about gendered norms, where they come from, and how they can be damaging. Another relationship between gender and competence is that men and women have different communication skills. To communicate competently, remember, you must have the skills to do so. Now, there's evidence to suggest that men and women have different levels of communication skills, most likely because boys and girls are socialized differently. For example, girls are more likely to be taught to be polite, to listen, and to share their emotions. On the other hand, boys are more likely to be taught to be assertive and to get straight to the point. Now, this doesn't mean that all men are one way and all women are the other way, but it does create a trend. For example, research has shown that people, regardless of gender, prefer to seek emotional support from women rather than from men because of the perceived skill difference in providing that emotional support. In other words, we believe that women are going to be better than men at communicating support. This semester, we'll talk about skills we should all be developing, regardless of our sex or gender, but that some of us may never have been taught because of our gender. Now, these are only two ways in which gender and communication competence are related, but we'll stop there for today. To review, communication is the process through which two or more parties interact to create and share meaning. Competent communication is good communication. The descriptive theory of competence takes an interpretive perspective and claims that competent communication requires appropriateness and effectiveness. The prescriptive theory of competence takes a social science perspective and claims that competent communication requires knowledge, skills, and motivation. Finally, gender is related to competence in many ways, including through norms and skills.